If you guys would just give a warm welcome to Nick Redfern. He's our next speaker.
Well, thanks everybody. Well, how's that? Is that okay? All right. Well, I'm going to keep it sort of casual, and if anybody's got any questions, just shout. Just put your hand up and ask a question, because we're talking about a few different things throughout the course of the lecture, and sometimes I know that when people are listening to an entire lecture for sort of 45 minutes, they might forget what the question was they were going to ask. So if you've got any questions, just feel free to put your hand up, and we can get a little bit of a back and forth conversation going, which I think is a good way of doing it. We're all sort of here to learn and share information. So like I said, just got a question, just let me know. But what I'm going to speak to you today about is UFOs in Texas. And one of the areas I tend to focus on for the most part is sort of government files, Air Force, military files on UFOs. And I'll give you a little bit of background as to how and why I got interested in the UFO subject and why I focus on that area. Although I live in Arlington, you can probably tell I don't have a Texas accent. I tried to put it on, but it doesn't really work. I kind of sound a bit stupid. But my dad was in the British Royal Air Force, which is the British equivalent of the US Air Force. And he worked on radar. He was a radar mechanic. And at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was still around, he was involved in a couple of UFO incidents where the radar operators at the base he was stationed at, which was called RAF Neatishead on the east coast of England, they reported seeing these on the radar scopes, these high-flying, fast-moving objects, which nobody could figure out what they were. They were performing all sorts of weird manoeuvres, like slowing down to a hovering position 20,000 feet above the North Sea, and then suddenly accelerating to like 500 or 600 miles an hour from zero, which is impossible for an aircraft, a helicopter, any sort of vehicle that we know of at least. And this went on for sort of 3 or 4 nights, and because my dad was a radar mechanic, he was brought in to sort of look at the equipment and calibrate it and just see if there were any problems with the radar scopes to determine if they were creating fake readings or bogus readings on the screens. And he found out that the machines were working perfectly normal. And so for that reason, he was had to literally sort of tell the personnel there's actually nothing wrong with the equipment at all. And so they were faced with the realization that something strange was flying in the skies over England and approaching the coastline. As I said, first thought was it's got to be the Russians, but it clearly wasn't. And when this went on for sort of 3 or 4 nights, eventually everybody was told, you won't talk about this. The British military has what's called the Official Secrets Act. And it's designed so when you join the military, if you're exposed to specific top secret information or secret information, you sign this piece of paper, the Official Secrets Act, which is designed to prevent people from blowing the whistle, so to speak. And my dad did stay silent on it for like 30 years, and he told me when I was about 12 or 13. And this is what really got me interested in the subject, not because it was my own dad who had this encounter, but also because he was trained in the military on radar. And that sort of opened my eyes to the idea that, wow, military and government agencies are interested in this subject and they're not telling us. And I always think if there's something that governments know and they're not telling us, we probably should really know what it's all about. And so I began to sort of read up on the subject, and then began lecturing on it, writing books, etc. And sort of developed an interest in following up on this government angle of the UFO subject. Now, from there, one of the things I investigated quite extensively in Texas are reports where we have interest in UFO cases on the part of the military, on the part of the CIA and the FBI in the 1950s. And we know this because they've now started to declassify a lot of files from the 40s and 50s which were previously classified. And they talk about extensive studies of UFO activity around Lubbock and Levelland, which I'll talk about in a bit, and also a number of cases from the 1980s, which really kind of stand out as very important cases. And so the fact that we've got these historical records demonstrates that the how and why these Texas reports were taken very, very seriously by the military. Now, before I get to sort of the angle of the government files and so on, just to sort of demonstrate to you that UFOs come in all shapes and sizes, you know, the term UFO essentially means unidentified flying object, and I think a small percentage of those UFOs are, whether it's extraterrestrial, whether it's interdimensional, multidimensional, we don't really know, but I think I firmly believe, based on the evidence, that a small percentage of UFO sightings are evidence of someone visiting us from somewhere else. You know, it's not American craft, it's not British, it's not the Russians, the Chinese. You know, when we look back into some of these early reports from the 40s and 50s, there's no way we had that technology back then. But as I said, UFOs come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And before we get to sort of the main part of the lecture, I want to talk a little bit about an area which some of you may know of, some of you may have been to, the Big Thicket, which is a large area of forest not too far from the city of Houston. Now, if you look at that sign, I don't know if you can see it at the back, but I'll read it to you if it's a little bit blurry. It says, Ghost Road, Scenic Drive, Hardin County Park, 8 Mile Drive. Now, that is a road called Bragg Road that runs all the way through the Big Thicket. It's about 6 miles long. And it's called Ghost Road locally, or actually the locals call it Ghost Light Road, because for more than a century, people have reported seeing these strange balls of light flitting through the woods of the Big Thicket. And nobody really knows what these are. Some people have suggested today that they could be, or some of them could be, sort of car headlights or something like that. The problem with that theory, of course, is that the reports of the ghost lights in the Big Thicket actually date back to the 1800s, the early 1800s. You know, nobody was driving a truck or a car, you know, back then around Texas or anywhere. So that doesn't really explain the phenomenon. But what people are typically describing are small balls of light, anywhere from the size of like a baseball up to a basketball. And so we're not talking about sort of metallic nuts and bolts UFOs. What we are talking about, though, are definitive UFOs in the sense that they're flying, they're unknown, and they're in the sky. And unlike most UFOs, the ghost lights of the Big Thicket generally fly at heights of sort of 15 to 20 feet. And what's sort of really interesting is that when people have said they've walked close to the lights to try and figure out what they are, the lights have sort of reacted and moved away from them or higher into the sky, suggesting that there might be some sort of degree of actual intelligence in related to these phenomena. And some researchers believe the ghost lights of the Big Thicket could be some sort of like an intelligent energy. You know, we're sort of flesh and blood and intelligent. We imagine a pure energy-based intelligence in the form of a ball of light. That's what a lot of people believe, researchers in the field believe, to be the true origin and nature of the ghost lights in that particular area. And I've been down there on a number of occasions. Once with the man on the right, a man named Rob Briggs. Rob unfortunately passed away just recently, but he wrote a book called In the Big Thicket, which is a really good study of the whole ghost light phenomenon in the Big Thicket area. And Rob's research has shown that the ghost lights go back far longer than most people thought. There are even indications of stories suggesting that when the first settlers came over and finally reached Texas, that they heard stories of these ghost lights as well from some of the Native Americans at the time. So, you know, it's a mystery with a long history attached to it. And as far as what the ghost lights are, as I said, there are down-to-earth theories, and you also have the theories that we're talking about something along the lines of an intelligent energy. Now that sort of raises the question, are we talking about an extraterrestrial intelligence? Are we talking about some sort of energy-based life force that is actually resident to the planet itself. You know, if we're able to prove this, that there could be some sort of life forms on our planet which are pure energy, that would be almost as amazing as discovering that we had literal aliens amongst us as well. Now again, before I just get to the main part of the story, a lot of people don't realise the important extent to which Texas actually played a role in the most famous UFO case of all, namely Roswell. Everybody, you know, whether people are interested in UFOs or not, everybody, if you say to them what happened at Roswell, most people will say, oh, that's the UFO crash story back in the 40s. And certainly it was. Back in 1947, in July, the military announced that it had recovered what at the time were referred to as flying discs. And that's one of the most interesting aspects of the story, was that they actually announced that that's what they'd recovered. But within 24 hours, it was a case of, sorry, we made a mistake, it was just a weather balloon, which is really hard to sort of accept, because many people don't know that the Roswell Army Airfield, as it was called at the time, was the home to the 509th Bomb Wing. And the 509th were actually the people who flew the bombs, the atomic bombs, to Japan, which were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so, you know, these guys weren't fools. They were sort of the elite of the military at the time. You know, just 2 years earlier, they dropped the bomb. And they couldn't tell the difference between a flying disc and a weather balloon. Well, you know, anybody can see what tattered balloon wreckage for what it is, but apparently these guys couldn't, at least for 24 hours, when it was suddenly, oh, it's not a flying disc after all, we just found a weather balloon. But the Texas angle comes into the fact that Jesse Marcel, Major Jesse Marcel, who was one of the first people on the crash site on the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, which is where the object, whatever it was, came down. Jesse Marcel was essentially told, or ordered I should say, to fly to Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, which backed onto Lake Worth, which isn't actually that far away. And I'm sure many of you, know your UFO history. You might have seen pictures on the internet of Major Marcel sort of on his hands and knees holding some of this wreckage up for the local press. And that's when they made the announcement that, sorry, after looking into it, we've concluded that what it actually is nothing stranger than a weather balloon. And as I said, this all went down at Carswell Air Force Base, the most famous UFO incident of all. So, Texas can be sort of proud of the fact that whatever happened at Roswell, we sort of played a major role in the case itself, in the history of it. And so the big question, of course, is, what did Carswell know? Was it just a convenient place to hold the press conference from, or was some of the wreckage taken to Carswell? Well, as far as we know for sure that some of the wreckage that was on display was weather balloon wreckage. So clearly somebody had got hold of a weather balloon and brought it in so that the press guys could photograph it. But there are also rumours of large crates having been transferred from Lincoln County, New Mexico, to Carswell, and then possibly onto what was called Wright Field, Ohio, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And again, the story is that some of this material, and maybe even some of the bodies, were briefly stored at Carswell. And just to make the story a little bit weirder, Lake Worth, where the base backed onto, is also the story, or the location, I should say, of a famous mystery, namely that of the Lake Worth goat man, which many of you might have heard of. A strange story, but a creature that was described almost like a white Bigfoot type animal that was seen near Lake Worth. So the whole area is sort of steeped in weirdness. And so in other words, but no, the people are fine, it's just the area that's a bit weird. But you find this situation where we find one of the leading Texas military bases playing a significant role in Roswell. And I think sometimes it's a little bit unfortunate that Texas hasn't been sort of noted for its role in the history of the Roswell story, which is, why I always like to bring it up to people to demonstrate it wasn't all just sort of focused around New Mexico. Now, one of the most famous of all the cases that occurred in Texas is what the story that became known as that of the Lubbock Lights. And this was a story that actually attracted the attention of not just the press or the local people in Lubbock, but also the US Air Force. And if you look at the context of the time, this was 1951, and the whole UFO subject kicked off in 1947. And in 1948, when it became clear to the military that the UFO phenomenon wasn't down to hysteria and hoaxes and pranks, etc., that it was a real phenomenon, the military set up a number of UFO programs to investigate this, as did later on the CIA. The Air Force's programs included Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. And the CIA had the Robertson Panel, the Air Force Intelligence did their own investigations, the FBI undertook studies as well, because it was treated very, very seriously at that particular time, and still is, but we just don't hear so much about it today in terms of what the government knows about the subject. But the Lubbock Lights was an important one because the first witnesses to this huge array of lights flying over the city of Lubbock in 1951, the first three witnesses were credible scientists. One was a geologist, another was a physicist. And so it really caught the media's attention because, you know, the media back then, and still unfortunately to a degree today, always sort of has to have a little tongue-in-cheek, fun-poking angle to, you know, how they report on it, you know, sort of how much did they have to drink before they saw a UFO, that kind of thing. But they couldn't really do that with these guys because they were credible scientists, you know, working out of Lubbock. And I'll just show you, that's just another clipping just to demonstrate how the media covered the story. New development adds to saga of Lubbock Lights phenomena. And certainly in the Lubbock area, if you go to the local library there, the main library, they've got a section of cuttings and clippings from that era that include photographs and stories and testimony from all the people who saw these lights. Now, they were called the Lubbock Lights because they're actually seen quite high in the sky. We're not talking about somebody seeing a UFO at sort of 70 or 80 feet. We're talking about objects that were seen at the height of perhaps an aircraft or something like that. But when I show you the photograph, or one of the photographs of them that were taken, you'll realise from the formation that they're not regular aircraft. Now, those photographs were actually taken by a guy in Lubbock, and they were handed over, or the negatives were handed over to the Air Force. And that collection there, those are the Air Force's copies, which you can find at the National Archives in Maryland. And as you can see, they're like a V formation. And there's been speculation, could it have been just one massive object, or was it a lot of small objects brightly lit up and flying in some sort of formation? A lot of people are still in two minds about that today. But we do get a lot of reports today of what are known as flying triangle type UFOs. And as the name suggests, they look like huge flying triangles, typically black. We also know that back in the 40s and 50s, the military was flying what became known as flying wing type aircraft. But these particular phenomena, whatever it is, were far bigger than anything we were flying. Estimates suggest the Lubbock Lights, you know, could be anywhere today, you know, in comparison with something like a jumbo jet. You know, so we're talking about something really, really big. The lights were seen on a number of occasions and photographed, as you can see here. So clearly something unusual was flying over the skies of Lubbock. And for the military, they came up with a fairly novel explanation. They suggested it was actually a formation of ducks flying across the sky. And I mean, really, I'm not making it up. They said it was a formation of ducks flying across the sky, and illumination was suggesting the idea that they were metallic. So, you know, it sort of it doesn't really hold water. Yeah.
What's the arrow pointing to?
Oh, well, that's actually a good question because that one light, as you can see, if you look at the bottom right picture, you can see that one solitary light. and it's close to the formation. Then further along, it's higher up, as if it's moving. That's one of the reasons why some researchers felt that it was actually multiple small UFOs flying in an extremely tight formation, but that one was out of the formation. So in that sense, you know, it gives us some sort of idea of what we're looking at. But then again, you have some researchers who say, well, maybe it was just one large object, and that was just one separate one on its own, a smaller one. So we're still no clearer to finding answers, but you know, we can say for the fact with the arrow that the military recognised that there was something significant going on, possibly with multiple objects, perhaps even breaking off from the main one. Yeah.
Would the geometric alignments from figure B to figure D indicate that they were individual objects, the lights, because the pattern has changed? You can see that the center one in figure B is at the very top of the V, while it's moved to the center in figure D as more time has passed.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you can see differences, and that's why, you know, personally, if people ask me, I think it was multiple small objects. Why would they fly in a formation like that, we don't know. But for me at least, the important thing is that the military was never actually able to explain away the Lubbock lights. You know, they came up with this one explanation for birds, but that doesn't really hold water when you consider the size of the lights that were reported on the screen. Now, we come to sort of one of the strangest stories from the early 1950s, which has a tie-in with the UFO phenomenon. That's a picture of me at Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where every year they have the Mothman Festival to sort of celebrate Mothman's presence in the town. Back in the 1960s, when the Mothman first appeared, which was chronicled in John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, it was described as this sort of winged humanoid creature with these bright red eyes and large wings. And by the way, I'm on the one on the left, Mothman's on the right. And people saw the Mothman, people had experiences with men in black, there were UFO sightings, UFO landings, things like this. And it became sort of a focal point for UFO research in the 1960s. But a lot of people don't know that long before the Mothman surfaced, there was a creature that briefly became known as the Houston Batman in the city of Houston. Now, it sounds a really strange story, and that's because it actually is a strange story. But it revolved around the sighting of this creature that looks actually quite like the Mothman, except for the fact it had a more human-looking head. And it dated back to the summer of 1953, when several people living in one particular housing block in Houston, it was a really hot night, had no air conditioning, you know, they woke up sort of 2 or 3 in the morning, just stifling hot, and went out onto the balcony, you know, with some iced tea or whatever, and just sat there trying to just deal with the heat. And 3 people reported seeing this, what you can only kind of describe as like as a flying man. It's the only way you could describe it. It was sort of about 7 to 7.5 feet tall, with these wings, and bizarrely described as having almost like a jetpack on his back, which, you know, sort of gives it really odd overtones as well. And the local media, the Houston newspapers, briefly covered this. You can find, if you Google Houston Batman, you'll soon find the story, and there are a couple of sites which have scanned in the original newspaper clipping. And a friend of mine, Ken Gerhard, a couple of years ago, went out to the area, and unfortunately the housing building itself isn't there anymore. I think it was sort of knocked down to extend one of the freeways. But Ken dug into this quite deeply, and he wasn't able to track down the witnesses, although they're named in the newspapers. But you know, we're talking 60 years later, so the chances are they're not even alive anymore now. But probably with sort of a deep investigation, you know, if anybody wants to look into it, you probably could find the family members of the people who saw this thing. And I really don't have any way to explain the Houston Batman, other than to say that in the same time frame, Houston did have a lot of UFO encounters within the city and around it. And we're talking literally sort of days before and days afterwards. So that does kind of tie in with the fact that when people saw Mothman in Point Pleasant, they also saw UFOs. When people saw the Houston Batman in Houston, they also saw UFOs. But again, things like flying humanoids are so controversial because it sort of really gets into bizarre territory. You know, it's one thing to talk about a Bigfoot and one thing to talk about a UFO. It's another thing entirely to say that you saw a flying humanoid. But again, Ken Gerhard, who I mentioned earlier, Ken wrote an entire book on the phenomenon called Encounters with Flying Humanoids, which is a really good book and tells multiple stories of hundreds of such cases all around the world. Some of them, not all, but some of them with a UFO component. So from my perspective, the Houston Batman story is one that really could and should be taken further because, you know, there could be still a lot of surprises in for us even after more than 60 years. Now, if we move to the town of Levelland, Texas, which is actually not far from the city of Lubbock, there was a wave of UFO activity in 1957. And I've titled this particular one, The Levelland UFO and Car Trouble, because within the UFO subject, we get a lot of what have become known as vehicle interference cases. And typically what happens is a person might be sort of driving home late at night on some lonely road, and suddenly the headlights go out on the car, the engine splutters, and sometimes it will just completely stall. And then suddenly this UFO will come into view. And the person's unable to start the car again, or, you know, the headlights or anything, the radio, nothing at all works, even though the ignition is still switched on. And the vehicle interference only goes away. The car or the truck only returns to normal when the UFO is gone, which kind of suggests pretty strongly that whatever the phenomenon is, whatever technology the UFOs employ, they're able to disable our engines, you know, whether it, as I said, whether a car, a truck, a motorbike even in some cases. And that's exactly what happened in Levelland in late 1957. In this particular case, people described what was a literal flying saucer. Incredibly, they described it as sort of like 200 feet in diameter. And if you've ever been to Levelland, which I have a couple of times investigating this case, in West Texas, it's very flat. And so it would be quite easy for something of a 200-foot diameter to land, you know, because there aren't that many buildings around that area even now. You know, there's no way a sort of 200-foot UFO could land in Dallas because it's very built up. But, you know, Levelland was and still is very, very different. So people describe this brightly lit, sort of silvery white, saucer-shaped object on the ground, and as they got closer to it, again, their engine stopped, the headlights went out, and they just sort of, you know, glided to a halt. And a number of the witnesses and a number of the people whose vehicles were affected were actually the local police. They were responding to sightings of the UFO, responding to people who said their vehicles had stopped working. And as the police got out there, they found the same thing then happened to them. You know, their cars stopped and they weren't able to radio back to headquarters. So this is one of the reasons why the story was taken so seriously, was because the local law enforcement personnel actually became the victims of the encounters as well. And again, the official reports, the police logbooks, etc., were all sent off to the Air Force for study. And the theory that the Air Force came up with, or the closest thing they could think of, was something called ball lightning. Ball lightning is actually a real sort of rare aerial phenomenon. Everybody sees normal lightning in the sky, but occasionally it can create in the form of like a ball-shaped object. But there's no evidence that it can actually have an adverse effect on car engines. So although, you know, it was an ingenious theory, it doesn't really hold that much water because ball lightning doesn't even sort of grow to a size of 200 feet. It's typically sort of maybe the very, very big is sort of the size of like a beach ball or something along those lines. So we're left with a lot of questions about the Levelland case. And that's another story from the same time period. As you can see, it's titled Blinding Flying Saucer Stops Texas Motor Cars. And again, that's one of the early original newspaper clippings that covered this particular story. And yeah.
Are you familiar with the Zone of Silence in Mexico, I believe?
Oh yeah, where they've had like similar kind of things going on.
Do you think that this could be possibly the same cause from the perhaps like the source of that, possibly?
Yeah, if you didn't hear, the question was, there's a place in Mexico known as the Zone of Silence, and there's actually other places as well where people have experienced weird car stops, sometimes in relation to UFOs, but on other occasions, it's just as if there's something in the area itself that is affecting the vehicles. There was a spate of incidents in the north of England back in the 1950s. I know of a number of cases similar in Australia from the 1980s. So whatever this phenomenon is that is affecting vehicles, and is obviously some sort of aerial component to it as well, we don't really see evidence of anybody being harmed, but there are a lot of cases kind of similar to the Levelland one, where people have reported alien abduction encounters, and then when they've been hypnotized and they've got some recall through the hypnosis, they've said that before they were abducted from their vehicles, something slowed down and stopped their cars. And which would make sense, if you want to kidnap someone from a vehicle, you're not going to be able to grab them when they're driving at 70 miles an hour. If you can sort of render their vehicle inoperative and stop the car and wipe their memory out, then it's not impossible, I think, that some of these Levelland witnesses may have actually been unknown abductees. They had no memory of what happened to them. All they remember is the car coming to a halt, and then the next thing, they're trying to get it going again. Yeah.
I was going to say, it sounds kind of like a small EMP kind of attack. It's making their cars go like that. Especially when have an announcement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point you make. The idea of some sort of like EMP weapon used to disable the vehicles. And today, we have that technology where we can disable a car engine. There's no doubt about that. But to have done that back in the 1950s, and then we have to also explain the presence of the UFO. So I think, whoever was doing it, it wasn't us. It was somebody else from somewhere else. Whether as a show of force, whether as a means to abduct people, we'll probably never know now, but the important thing is we do have the clippings, we've got the Air Force reports which have now been declassified, again showing significant UFO encounters in Texas. Now, we come to what is probably the most significant, from my perspective at least, Texas-based UFO case. This occurred in December 1980. Not too far from the Big Thicket, ironically. It's become known as the Cash-Landrum UFO incident. And that's the cover of a book written by a guy named John Schusler. John looked very, very deeply into the story of this particular case, which, as I said, occurred on December 28th, 1980, not too far from the Texan town of Huffman. And two women and a young boy were driving home after a late night dinner, and they saw this strange light in the sky. Bear in mind, they were sort of going down a country road. It's very dark, there's not many street lights, just fields and woodlands surrounding them. And they suddenly saw this light in the sky. They had no idea what it was, but they described it as somewhat diamond-shaped, as you can see from that picture. Now, as it got closer, it took on even more of like a definitive diamond-type shape. And they had no idea what it was. They were terrified. They brought the car to a halt, and they actually weren't that far in front of the object, which came really low on the ground, had this light coming out from underneath it, which lit up the tarmac of the highway, or the little road, I should say. And they got out of their vehicle because they suddenly felt this sort of overwhelming, oppressive heat inside the car. They just had to get out. They jumped out of the car, and one of them, Betty Cash, hence the name Cash-Landrum, Betty Cash was the one person who sort of walked closer to this particular object. She didn't know what it was. She got very, very close to it, and it was emitting all this heat, etc. Well, as they continued to watch this object, they suddenly heard this beating sound in the sky and saw like an entire squadron of double rotor helicopters, black helicopters, appear on the screen. And as you can see on John's cover, there's a double rotor helicopter on the left and on the right, just to sort of demonstrate the presence of the helicopters. But the witnesses counted, they thought there were 23 helicopters. Now, the big question is, what did they see and what was the reason for the presence of the helicopters? Well, that's one of the most important questions. The other one relates to the witnesses themselves. For example, I mentioned how Betty Cash actually got quite close to the object. Well, within days, she actually fell seriously ill. Her hair started to fall out in clumps. She developed sores, and eventually, unfortunately, she died of breast cancer. And this has given rise to the idea that the object was either radioactive or was possibly even was giving off some sort of like a chemical, maybe, like an aerosol-based chemical that affected her health. We'll probably never know, unfortunately, but she was encouraged to take legal action against the military. But unfortunately, that didn't, from her perspective, that didn't hold up because nobody could find out where these 23 helicopters had come from. So that part of the story really stalled. But the big question is, what was the UFO? Now, in the UFO research community, there are sort of two theories as to what the object may have been. One is that it was a genuine UFO that was malfunctioning, and the presence of the helicopters was, if you like, a kind of a quick reaction military unit that was designed to recover the object. If it sort of severely malfunctioned and crashed, then the helicopter crews would move in, seal off the area, and possibly even be responsible for sort of lifting the aircraft out of the area. Now, excuse me. That's the primary two witnesses. That's Betty Cash on the right. And as I said, her hair just started to fall out in clumps. Days afterwards, she felt extremely ill. That is the particular type of helicopter, a Chinook, which the witnesses described as being present, except they were just totally black. And military agencies, do have sort of quick reaction teams to respond to emergency events. And one of them, a famous one, was known as Project Moondust. This was a program that the Air Force set up in the 50s, and which was really active in the 60s to recover things like Soviet space rockets and satellites that had fallen to Earth, because we want to see what the Russians were doing. So they would send these quick reaction units in. The other theory that's been suggested is that the object may not have been a UFO, but was possibly some sort of nuclear-powered aircraft of the military. And the idea was that the military may have been test flying some sort of prototype nuclear-powered craft. It started to malfunction, and the team was there, again, not to sort of retrieve it in the same way you would a UFO, but to sort of retrieve a malfunctioning object of the military itself. And even to this day, the UFO community is very much sort of split on the nature of whatever happened to them, but something clearly did. And other witnesses have come forward to say they saw the helicopters as well. Other people saw the craft. So it was clearly a genuine incident. And for me, at least, without doubt, the most significant of all the various Texas cases that have gone on over the years. And through the Freedom of Information Act, the military has released hundreds of pages on this particular case because they were very concerned. They were worried by the fact that somebody was making a claim that they'd been essentially sort of irradiated by the presence of this UFO, which may well have been sort of nuclear powered. And particularly when it went to a court case, there was major concern. And it was never really resolved. But one of the interesting things is that just barely 24 hours before this incident occurred, there was what is probably Britain's most famous UFO case occurred in a place called Rendlesham Forest on the east coast of England. And there actually are some weird parallels between the Rendlesham Forest case and this one. For example, the nearest Air Force base to Rendlesham Forest is called Bentwaters, or was, it's closed down now. And Bentwaters was where the guys were based, the military guys were based, who had this UFO experience in Rendlesham Forest. Well, it so happens that the same base, Bentwaters, was home to a quick recovery-based unit which used helicopters, which were on standby to recover astronauts in the event that in the Apollo missions the craft malfunctioned and crashed, and if they landed in Europe somewhere or crash landed in Europe, this retrieval team would go out from RAF Bentwaters to recover the Apollo astronauts. What's interesting is that although they were based at Bentwaters, their original headquarters was actually at the NASA headquarters in Houston, and Houston was barely like 40 miles. Excuse me, the headquarters was barely 40 miles from where this incident occurred. So one of the theories is that the object that came down in Rendlesham Forest may have been sort of clandestinely shipped across to the United States, or even flown, because it was described as being a small object. And that what we might have seen is the object then being transferred when it reached the US mainland, possibly to somewhere in Texas for study. The time frame, even the sort of the diamond pyramid type shape that's been described to the Rendlesham Forest object, parallels quite closely the Cash-Landrum UFO. And as I said, the time frame also is an important factor. Just barely 24 hours later, we've got these two military issues, if you like, both in relation to quick reaction units, one of which occurred in England but has its headquarters in Houston, which, as I said, was barely 40 miles from where this incident occurred. So I do think there could be a potential tie-in here, but again, whether that means it's a UFO or some sort of secret object, I mean, that's a different thing entirely. Two other things I just want to mention. One is the matter of the Men in Black. Now, everybody's sort of seen or heard of the movies, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. But if you look at the original, or the real reports, I should say, most of the Men in Black are described as being very, very strange. They're sort of pale, skinny. They wear these sort of 1940s and 50s fedora-type hats and skinny black ties. They kind of look like they've stepped out of a 1940s black and white gangster movie, except for the fact that they actually don't really look human. They kind of look like dead people dug up, is how one witness actually described it. They sort of look very pale, they have these bulging eyes, and they threaten UFO witnesses. Over the years, I've actually collected probably 14 or 15 stories of people in Texas who've been visited and threatened by the Men in Black. And I've got a new book out right now, it's called Men in Black, which includes witness reports of 3 of the primary witnesses that I spoke to. And it even amazed me the sheer number of reports that I've got from Texas itself, of people who said, they saw a UFO, then a couple of nights later, around 11 o'clock, midnight, there was this sort of slow bang on the door. For effect, I'm sure, the Men in Black kind of never go. It's always kind of out of a Dracula movie or something like that. And I think it's done for effect to frighten people. Now, of course, most of us wouldn't open the door at midnight if you heard a low banging on your front door. You'd probably look through the spy hole at the very least, or you'd call the police. And if they try to force their way in, well, that's their fault. So, it's one of these situations where people then wonder, why did I let them in? It's almost as if their mind or their mental faculties have been taken over. They're almost been placed into a sort of hypnotic state where the Men in Black are able to control the situation and permit them to come inside. And that's one of the other weird things, is that the Men in Black sort of don't force themselves into people's homes. What they do, they wait to be invited in, which is kind of like the old legends of folklores of vampires that, before they can come in your home, they have to be invited. I'm not saying the Men in Black are vampires, of course, but you do have that parallel. So, that in itself is a weird thing that how they manage to find their way into so many people's homes, and people just sit there and take the threats. And then the men in black suddenly get up, shuffle out the door, and then after about 5 minutes, it's almost as if the person's coming round from like anaesthetic, and they're like, well, why did I even let them in? Why did I let them threaten me? And there are good indications that they are able to affect the minds of the witnesses. So we're dealing, as far as I'm concerned, with not government agents or, you know, Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones, secret agents or anything, nothing like that. We're dealing with something that is connected to the UFO phenomenon itself, and which camouflages itself by these, you know, these pulled down fedoras, wraparound sunglasses, only coming out at night where they're not going to be seen and identified too much. And as I said, I've got a lot of reports from Texas in relation to significant UFO encounters. And one last thing, a couple of people have actually asked me pretty much the same question today, because a lot of people know I sort of write about strange creatures as well. 2 people asked me today, is the Texas Chupacabra an alien? Well, no, it's not. Not in my opinion anyway. You know, people talk about the Texas Chupacabra, which actually are, they're hairless coyotes, but it's not that simple. The skeptics have just said, you know, they're coyotes with mange, but they're not, because for the most part, they're sort of uniformly 100% hairless. That's to say, you know, it's not like mange, which you have patchy hair, you know, the animals scratch themselves and itch to the point where infection sets in and, you know, they die very often. It's not like that. They're developing quite happily with no hair at all. And in many cases, their front limbs are shorter than normal, which when they're moving kind of gives them a sort of kangaroo-like hopping movement. There have even been some reports of them rearing up on their hind legs and kind of balancing a little bit for a few moments, which regular coyotes cannot do that. So this has given rise to the idea that there could be some sort of spontaneous mutation going on in the species that is affecting them at a DNA level, and we don't know why. Ken Gerhard has noted that a number of, where you get clusters of these animals, we also get a lot of coal-burning plants. And one of the offshoots of coal-burning plants is that they give off something called sulfur dioxide, and sulfur dioxide is what's called a mutagen. It's like mercury. If you, like a pregnant woman ingests mercury by mistake, it can cause sort of catastrophic birth defects, and that goes for any animal, not just people. And Ken wonders if there could be some sort of mutagen that is affecting these animals. But if it's affecting them physically, it's also doing sort of psychologically. There's I've got one almost like a creepy case from Texas, where a rancher not too far out, somewhere between Austin and San Antonio, you've got sort of typical large ranch with fields, you know, and areas of woodland. And his animals had been attacked by this creature, which he described as like a Texas Chupacabra. And he went out in his truck, got his gun with him, and he saw this creature in daylight. And that's one of the weird things. These creatures hunt during the day, not like a lot of coyotes, which typically come out at night. And he said that he got out and he saw this animal, he raised his rifle, he was about to shoot it, and he kind of got that feeling that we all get from time to time, where you think someone's looking at you. You know, if you're in the checkout line or whatever, you turn around and somebody is looking at you. We all, for some reason, we don't know how we do it, but we know we all get that kind of feeling now and again. And he turned around and saw there was another one to the right of him. They were both sort of between about 75 to 100 feet away from him. Then he turned to his left and there was another. So there was like one here, one there, and one there. And he kind of got this feeling that they were sort of like triangulating him, and they were sort of getting closer and closer. And he, you know, he was sort of, you know, a big, tough Texas rancher, and he told me that he just did not hang around. He just jumped in the truck and got out of the area because he felt they were sort of intelligent and sort of intelligently triangulating him as well. And so, to answer the question, no, I don't think they're space aliens. You know, they're not alien space dogs or anything like that. But they're not just coyotes with mange. There's something sort of seriously weird going on with them as well. So that sort of wraps up my sort of quick study of UFOs in Texas, and I'll be outside at my table. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks a lot.
We are so thankful that you guys have came and stayed all day. Wow. I mean, this is impressive. Thank you so much, Nick, for coming out. If you guys want to, you're welcome to go out to the tables and meet some more of the authors and speakers if you'd like. I'd love for you guys to give just a shout out to MD Resort and all of our sponsors who've helped out. That's been awesome. Yep, they've done a great job. And then also, if you guys, who all went on the bus tours? Did you guys, most of y'all get to go? Yes, a lot of you? Yeah, pretty good. So we appreciate you guys coming out so much. Sorry, again, I'm a mover. We appreciate it so much. Next year, we already have plans in the works for next year's event. So it's going to be the 120th annual. So we're going to have, this was kind of a trial run to see how well it would be perceived from our community and from people that were interested. So we appreciate you guys so much for coming out and making this a successful event. If y'all guys have any questions, we're here. And otherwise, there's free laser tag out in the front. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.